coronavirus pandemic, it was identified as the epicenter of the outbreak in New York City, which itself was the epicenter of the pandemic early on for the United States. There has been a high infection rate among residents of Elmhurst and surrounding communities like Corona and Jackson Heights, but that epicenter designation also referred to the overwhelming activity at Elmhurst Hospital, which is located just little over half a mile down Broadway from where we're standing. I'll tell you a little more about Elmhurst Hospital when we can see it, when we're closer to it at the end of the tour. We're not actually going right in front of it. But I am here on Broadway at 51st Avenue. I am standing in front of the Elmhurst branch of the Queens Public Library. This branch has not reopened yet, but normally it is the second busiest branch in the Queens Library system. And as you can see, it has an outdoor courtyard, which some people might be sitting in. This library, this building you see, just opened in December 2016. It replaced a 100-year-old Carnegie Library. And as you can see, it's several stories tall. There's all kinds of space inside to relax and read or just hang out, attend events. There are classes and literary events. And of course, a media center with a multilingual recording collections, and of course, all the books and periodicals. Now, as it's less than 4 years old, it is one of the newer buildings in Elmhurst, and coincidentally, it stands right across the street from the oldest building in Elmhurst. This is known as Old St. James. It is not only the oldest building in Elmhurst, it's one of the oldest buildings in all of New York. It has been standing there since 1735, so almost 300 years. It has not been used for regular worship services since 1848, although St. James Church is still in existence. We'll go to the current building in just a little while. These are the original round arched windows. The wood shingles are also original, and some of the timbering. So you see it's a quaint little box-like structure. It was established originally as a mission church of the Grace Episcopal, which is the very old congregation in Jamaica. But it eventually grew into its own parish known as St. James. So as I said, this building is from 1735. It was just designated a New York City landmark in 2017. St. James ceased using it for worship services back in 1848 when they built a larger church a block away. This was used as a chapel and for Sunday school for several decades. And then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, community groups like Boy Scouts and I think some veterans groups occasionally met or held events here. But it's been empty pretty much since the 1990s. It is one of 3 churches founded during the colonial era that still exist in Elmhurst. And we will head over to another of those now. walking just one block west on Broadway, or Queens version of West. Anybody who has walked or biked or driven around Queens knows that the streets can be very frustrating. There appears to be a grid because there are numbered streets and avenues, but there are also a lot of named streets crossing through, and many streets or avenues do not seem to run directly north, south, or east, west, and that's certainly the case with Broadway. Broadway ends or begins at the East River in Astoria, so we are technically heading west, but it's actually more like northwest. So as I said, we're just going one block to Corona Avenue, passing the Reformed Church of Newtown. But we're actually going to cross Corona and look first at the current location of St. James Church. Actually, we don't have to cross Corona. You can just show people. So as I mentioned, St. James moved into a newer building in 1848, and it was located right there. That church burned down in the mid-1970s. And that is when the current building that you can see now replaced it. Now, like many of these very old congregations in Queens and elsewhere around the city, St. James congregation has dwindled considerably in size, occasionally to the point that its continued existence was in jeopardy. But it has also made itself available as a sort of community center. There are weekly yoga classes held there, other service and community groups. They've really opened it up for that. And of course, these events that I talk about, I'm not quite sure they're going on now, but when everything's operating as scheduled outside of the pandemic. So that's St. James. Here is the Reformed Church of Newtown. St. James is an Episcopal church. In fact, it is a founding member of both the Episcopal Archdiocese of New York and the Episcopal Diocese, of Long Island. The original Dutch inhabitants of Newtown, which was the early name of Elmhurst, and I'll give some more history on that in just a moment, formed this Reformed church. And you can see that it's a little out of place with all these 20th century brick apartment buildings and a Walgreens across the street. This congregation was established in the early 18th century. This building is from 1831. It is their second building. Now, as we proceed on Corona Avenue here, both on the side next to the Reformed Church and across Corona in the yard of St. James, you see these cemeteries. This is where some of the founding families of Elmhurst, or actually of Newtown, are. And also, if you're familiar with many of the roads of Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island, you will recognize names in this cemetery like Ditmars and Van Brunt and Remsen. We're actually going to walk through the cemetery because I do want to show you something on the front of the building. And that is the cornerstone from the Reformed Church of Newtown's original building. Its original building dates to 1731. As I said, this one that's standing now is from about 100 years later. But the plaque there is giving you some history, which I will tell you about in just a little bit. And then at the bottom is the cornerstone. From the original church, the bell tower of this church also has the original bell from that 1731 church. Now, the third very historic church in Elmhurst, which is actually the oldest of the three, we are not going to get to because it's over on Queens Boulevard, a little too far off our route. But I can share a photo here. If you have rode along Queens Boulevard, you may recognize it. It's across from the Queens Place Mall. This is a Presbyterian church, the oldest Presbyterian congregation in New York City. It dates back to the 1650s. This building on Queens Boulevard is its fifth building. It's been standing there since the 1890s. At one point, I believe in the 1920s, when they widened Queens Boulevard, they moved this building back 125 feet. And at that time, it also lost its steeple. It was removed for the project and then never reinstalled. This is another church that, again, has a very small regular congregation at this point. But whenever there are events and festivals involving the historic churches of New York City, it's always prominent there. So now we're going to head up Corona Avenue a few blocks. We have about 3 or 4 blocks before we reach our next site. And I will fill you in on the history of Elmhurst as I walk. So we've already encountered this name Newtown. That was the previous name of Elmhurst. Newtown was established around 1652. Now, actually, there'd been an earlier settlement established about 1642-43 that was centered near today's present-day Maspeth. That settlement only lasted about a year, and it was destroyed in a war between the Dutch colonists and the Native Americans. And then about 10 years later, some of those original settlers regrouped along with some newer arrivals and established this settlement that became known as Newtown. They moved a little farther inland, I guess thinking that would be safer because the original settlement had been close to Newtown Creek. And so this grew into one of the colonial towns of Queens. Today, Western Queens includes many different, what today are many different neighborhoods. So would extend probably as far south as present-day Glendale, north up into Astoria, and as far east as Forest Hills and Flushing Meadows Park. All of that was the town of Newtown. But there was also a village of Newtown that was the town seat. And that is where we are. So that is why it is Elmhurst that is said to be previously Newtown. And of course, that's also why all these churches and some of the other historic buildings are in this small area, because this was the town seat. In fact, just one block in the other direction on Broadway from where I started, there's a road that meets Broadway called Justice Avenue, and there's a little triangle. It has that name because that was the site of Newtown's town hall, where the town offices, the town clerk, the courthouse, the jail cell were all located. But there's an earlier name. Newtown was actually known originally as Middleburg. And you may see that spelled middle L-E or E-L, with or without an H at the end. That was actually the original name of the settlement that eventually became the town of Newtown. It was when the British took over the colony of New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, that the Dutch name of Middleburg Middleburg. Shall I keep talking? Is that okay? I think we're having just a little difficulty with the video feed. Okay. So again, we're here at Middleburg Triangle. Middleburg became Newtown, and then Newtown became Elmhurst right around the turn of the century, which was also right around the time that Queens, along with Brooklyn, Staten Island, the Bronx, and Manhattan, all consolidated. That's known as the Consolidation of Greater New York, which took effect in 1898, when they all became 5 boroughs of New York City, creating New York City as we know it today. So it was right around that time. Newtown's name was changed to Elmhurst, and the real estate company Cord Meyer, which still exists here in Queens, came in and basically started transforming this old-fashioned kind of country village into a modern city neighborhood known as Elmhurst. Cord Meyer built housing, they installed sewer lines, they established trolley service, they had the streets laid out and paved. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're making a turn here on 90th Street off of Corona Avenue. That's Newtown High School. We're going to come back to that. Newtown High School, of course, hard to miss. Even when you're not as close to it as we are now, that basically gives Elmhurst a skyline. But I will be talking about that magnificent building in just a little bit. First, I am taking you to a parking lot. Now, obviously I didn't bring you over to this parking lot and tire yard to see what's here now, but to talk about this site. In 2011, construction workers were doing some digging here, and they came upon a coffin made of iron. It had a woman's body inside. The police thought it was the victim of a recent homicide. That's how preserved the body was. It turned out that body was from over 150 years earlier. It was a woman who probably died around 1851. And further investigation revealed that this is the site of an African American burial ground. St. Mark's AME Church, which still exists today on Northern Boulevard, around 96th Street. It had been established with a different name in 1828, which was just a year after emancipation in New York State. And this was its original location. There was a meeting house, a church, and a churchyard, a burial ground. So it is believed there are 300 or possibly more bodies buried here. Now, this site had construction going on because it had been purchased by a developer. I believe that developer put it on the market last year, the site. It is currently unprotected, but several local organizations, including the Newtown Historical Society and the Elmhurst History and Cemeteries Preservation Society, are trying to get it protected, landmarked. This spot, the Elmhurst, it's basically just known as the Elmhurst African American Burial Ground, was on the list of 7, I believe it's called 7 to Save sites, endangered sites by the Preservation League of New York State. And if you want to get more information about this site, but also about the whole investigation that uncovered what they know about that woman, who she was, and the community that she was part of, there's a special on public television, part of the series called Secrets of the Dead. And the episode's called The Woman in the Iron Coffin. You can probably watch it online or on demand at the PBS website. So now we're heading back across Corona Avenue on 90th Street to Newtown High School. This is one of the architectural masterpieces of Queens. It is one of the architectural masterpieces of the New York City school system. Many of the very distinctive historic public schools around New York are in the Gothic or collegiate Gothic style. So this one's quite special because it is the Flemish Renaissance Revival style. See the step gables, which are a classic element of Flemish or Dutch architecture. That nearly 200-foot tall central tower with these smaller towers surrounding. There has been a church on this site since the 1860s. Children of all ages from the village of Newtown were educated here. As the population grew, they separated them into schools by age. So it was around 1910 that Newtown High School was established in an older building, and then this building opened in 1921. It's one of the many schools around New York City that were designed by C.B.J. Snyder. He was the head of school construction for New York City Public Schools for many years. His buildings were known as Palaces of the People, which I think is extra appropriate here because there is definitely a palatial or castle-like quality to Newtown High School. Newtown High School has a number of famous alumni, including actress Zoe Saldana, the comedian Don Rickles, Estee Lauder of cosmetics fame, and Gene Simmons of the rock group Kiss are just some of the famous alumni of Newtown High School. If we walk on that side, you're going to cross back here now and walk along 48th Avenue. Now, some of the outer wings of the high school were added later in the 1930s, and then there was a further addition made in the 1950s. But they did retain that Flemish Renaissance style in most places. So you can see this is really quite a monumental building. With a student body in the thousands. Have there been any questions? No. Okay. You are able to ask questions using the YouTube chat. I wanted to make sure that's what it's called on YouTube. So please type in any questions you have and they will be relayed to me. And we're just going to proceed from the school, a couple of short residential blocks. We are now on 48th Avenue. Cute little church. Now, this next part of the tour will include some sites of historical interest, but we're now moving a little more away from all the history and looking at contemporary Elmhurst. because if there's another word you're going to use to describe Elmhurst other than historic, it would be diverse or multicultural. It is a quintessential Queens neighborhood. You may know that Queens has been identified as the most ethnically diverse place on earth. And Elmhurst is one of the most diverse neighborhoods within Queens. Okay, at the next corner. The population currently is about 40 to 45% Asian, 40 or 45% Latino, but of course within that we have many, many countries and regions represented. China, Taiwan, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Nepal, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Mexico, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Peru, Ecuador, Uruguay, and I'm of course, oops, I actually overshot. That's where I wanted to go. It's okay, doesn't matter. This is fine. Anyway, so many, many other countries now. You may have heard that it is predicted that within 10 or 20 years, maybe even sooner, the United States as a whole will be white minority. But that has been the case here in Elmhurst for quite some time now. So a real melting pot, as you may have already seen, as we've shown you some of the commercial areas and stores, and you will see more of. We are back on Corona Avenue. So now in just the next few blocks, there you will see this amazing diversity of cultures and faiths in just a small area. So here to begin, across the street from where we're walking, is a Hindu temple. I believe they actually took over an old supermarket and converted it. Also located on this stretch of Corona Avenue is the Chan Meditation Center. We're coming on it right now. Now, this is actually a temporary location because the Chan Meditation Center is expanding its regular quarters, which are just another block away. Now, Chan is just another spelling for the word Zen. This is a Zen Buddhist facility. There is a monastery on site, but they hold meditation programs, chanting sessions, and other services, and they are open to everyone. This has been around since the 1970s. I believe they also have a retreat facility upstate. But as I mentioned, their real location is just one block away on Corona Avenue. A few years ago, they purchased the adjacent building. So they've been doing a big project that's going to bring everything under one roof over at Corona Avenue and 91st Place. But in the meantime, they've been using this location. Oh, yes.
where is the exact location, address-wise, of the iron coffin and the burial ground? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yes, where I took you? Yes. That's, oh, okay. I'm going to repeat. We got a question. Somebody wanted to know the exact location for the African burial ground where that iron coffin, the woman in the iron coffin was found. It is on 90th Street, right off of Corona Avenue. That parking lot, the buildings that border the parking lot, the storefronts, face Corona Avenue. So, and it's a short block anyway. There is an exact address. I can't quite remember the number, so I don't want to guess and give you wrong information. But if you are at Corona Avenue, just turn your back to Newtown High School. And again, you walk 20 feet and you will see that parking lot, 90th Street.
And then we have a second question of why are the houses different in different blocks? And what type of architecture is it?
That's a great observation. And so I'm glad to know. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I have to repeat the question. Somebody was wondering why the housing, there's so many different styles, and is there a style, a name for it? Which is a good observation, and that also means we've been filming quite a bit, because Elmhurst is quite a mishmash of housing. And there is no one style that predominates, really. There are a lot of brick apartment buildings from 4 to 8 stories generally. Those would have all been built probably starting in the 1920s, 1930s, and continuing throughout the 20th century. And now there are quite a few high-rises, more modern condos being built around Elmhurst. There are still row houses, and I will be pointing out in a little while some of the row houses that Cord Meyer, as I mentioned, the original developer of Elmhurst, built. And also a lot of freestanding houses, including some that were basically old farmhouses. They have been altered a lot, but you know, if you really walk around the neighborhood and look, you can probably spot the ones based on the size and the profile. But unfortunately, for a long time, there was not a really dedicated and active preservation effort. I mean, this was actually a problem that plagued much of Queens, not just Elmhurst. The crumbling New York State Pavilion from the World's Fair is probably the main example. Perhaps if that was in Manhattan or Brooklyn, it would have been preserved better all these years, and we're not like playing catch up to save it. But unfortunately, that did mean that most of the housing from anything before early years of the 20th century has been lost.
We have a third question who wants to know if they can join us physically on the walk, but we're doing it virtually.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just walking and looking to passerbys like I'm talking to myself. I guess it's not unusual anymore because of people talking on their phones a lot. Yeah, this is just a virtual experience. But once we are able to do tours in person again, I do hope you'll join us. And I will be talking about some of those because I had some planned before the pandemic hit for the Queens Historical Society, and we are hoping we will be able to have them maybe next year. That was a question about joining up the tour. I guess it's somebody local, okay? Elmhurst has several very busy commercial streets. Corona Avenue, which we're on, is obviously one of them. I would say really the main commercial drag is Broadway, where we started the tour, and we will be back on Broadway at the end. And then, of course, there is Queens Boulevard, where our tour began. We were just a few blocks from Queens Boulevard. If you need any help, let me know. Okay. So we're just waiting to cross Corona Avenue. This is a slightly treacherous intersection. We're going to be going over that railroad bridge. I mean, I guess a railroad bridge, most people think of a bridge that trains go on. So I'm calling it a railroad bridge because it crosses the railroad tracks, as we will see.
This tour is being saved to YouTube. Yes.
Oh, so apparently we had a question about whether this tour is being saved, so it will be viewable later, and the answer is yes. So I'm standing on the bridge. You see the railroad tracks? These are the active Long Island Railroad tracks, the Port Washington line, and there was a stop here in Elmhurst until the mid-1980s. So for over 100 years, the Long Island Railroad did serve Elmhurst. About 7 or 8 years ago, the MTA started looking into the possibility of reopening the station here because the population of Elmhurst had grown so much. It was a way to alleviate the load on the subways. So there were some surveys conducted of residents and other feasibility studies. And at one point, a significant amount of money was allocated for pursuing this project. But I believe what happened was a subsequent budget greatly reduced the amount. And now, of course, with the pandemic and accompanying economic woes, the MTA is, in some financial dire straits, some have said, and I guess they're going to have to be concentrating on maintaining the service that's already there. But you can see that even on this bridge, some people have left those famous love locks that a tradition I think originated in Paris and has now become something of a plague on bridges around the world. Now walking along 43rd Avenue. We just passed Hampton Street. We're going to be turning at Ithaca Street. In this part of Elmhurst, the streets are in alphabetical order. So there's Ketchum, Judge, Ithaca, Hampton, Glean, Forley, Albertson. Of course, it continues in both directions. Now, continuing with a tour of the religious diversity here in Elmhurst. The first building you may sight here on Ithaca Street, which a whole bunch of pigeons seem to be enjoying, is the old church, I believe now used as a chapel, of St. Bartholomew's, which is a Roman Catholic congregation. We will get a better look at their facilities in just a little bit. But we're going to turn our attention to what's across Ithaca Street. We are approaching it now. This is the Jain Center of North America. Jainism is an ancient Indian religion. I believe it has about 4 or 5 million followers worldwide, mostly in India. There are about 50,000 Jains in the United States. And this organization has existed here in Queens for several decades. This building was dedicated in 2005. Now, when I do in-person tours in Elmhurst, we go inside the Jain Center. Obviously, because of social distancing and other concerns, I'm not going to do that now. But if you come here on your own, and I do encourage you to do that, you actually go what would seem to be the back of the church. You go toward where there is parking, and that's how you enter, not the church, the temple, sorry. That's how you enter the facility. You do have to take off your shoes. They are welcoming. In fact, there have been times I've taken some people here and they not only welcomed us, they gave us some Indian sweets on our way out. So this building is several stories. It has dining facilities and meeting rooms and I think children's play space and auditorium. But also on each floor, there are temples. And these are large rooms that have shrines and idols. There's a lot of gold. A number of the statues are made of precious or semi-precious gemstones. Some are made of ivory. Jainism is a pacifist religion. Its tenets are mainly promote a somewhat ascetic lifestyle, just to give you a very cursory description of it. But you can learn a lot more visiting, because in the stairwells, as you're walking between floors, there are tons of signs and posters explaining all aspects of Jainism, the customs, the beliefs, the rituals. And you definitely want to go up to the 4th floor, where there is a shrine. It weighs 7.5 tons. I think it's like 8 feet tall. It's made of crystal, and it has, I think it's 40 or 50 niches cut into it that have small idols of various deities that are carved from precious and semi-precious stones. So really quite an interesting and unique site. So that is the Jane Center of America here on Ithaca Street in Elmhurst. And again, I just want to remind everybody who's watching, feel free to ask any questions using the YouTube chat feature. Just type in your question and it will be relayed to me by our videographer. So we are now coming around to the front of St. Bartholomew's Church. As I said, we passed their older building when we first turned on Ithaca. This is a large and very active Catholic congregation, St. Bartholomew's. And just a few yards away, you got the tower, from St. Bartholomew, just across the street really. This is the Elmhurst Baptist Church. I call this the Jane Austen Church because to me it looks like something out of a Jane Austen novel. So kind of funny here if you see its surroundings. So this Baptist church was established in the very early years of the 20th century, around 1905, 1906. St. Bartholomew just a few years after that. And actually both St. Bartholomew and there is a Chinese language Christian church on the next block. They, before their current buildings were completed, they held services here at the Baptist church. This Baptist church now has a very large Indonesian membership. You may see from the signage out front that the space is also used by a Punjabi congregation. That is very typical in, I think, throughout Queens, but certainly in this area of Queens, that churches, particularly some older churches, are now used by several different congregations. But this is a center of the Indonesian community in New York City. And now just looking down Judge Street, we can see some of the townhouses that were built by Cord Meyer in the early years of Elmhurst as Elmhurst. These are English-style townhouses dating to about 1904, 1905 on Judge Street, right off of Whitney Avenue. We're actually going to go in the other direction on Judge. Walking alongside a park known as Veterans Grove. So this is the city park. Here you see the sign, Veterans Grove. We're over on the sort of children's side of it with the playground. Over at the other side, there's just some benches. But I do want to take this opportunity to mention another park in Elmhurst that I wasn't able to include on this tour for distance. And it also has a connection to veterans. And that's Elmhurst Park, which is on the south side of Queens Boulevard. So about a mile from where our tour began. Elmhurst Park is the site of the legendary, or some might say notorious, Elmhurst Gas Tanks. Now, for generations, people who never actually set foot in Elmhurst knew it, because these gas tanks, which were like the height of a 20-story building, were used as markers by traffic reporters on the radio. They were, because they were so tall, they were visible from the highways. And it's like just about a mile outside of the Queens Midtown Tunnel. So if traffic like going into Manhattan was starting to back up, taking a little intermission while these dogs greet each other. Anyway, if you... So if you lived in New York City a few decades ago, you probably remember hearing, I never listened to the radio and heard traffic reports, you probably remember hearing about traffic getting backed up at the tanks. That was sort of a refrain on the radio, and those were the Elmhurst Gas Tanks, which long ago became obsolete because natural gas is now stored underground rather than in these large tanks. But they stood there for several years unused. They were finally dismantled in the 1990s, and the gas company sold the land to the city for $1. But then something like $20 million was spent on decontaminating the land and turning it into a green space, which it is now. It's actually a very lovely park, about 6 acres, has hilly space, a big lawn, and they have maintained a gas or energy theme. The comfort stations are cylindrical in shape, like the gas tanks were, and the play equipment in the playground, some of it is shaped like molecules of energy. But the other reason I mentioned it here, because that in front of the Veterans Grove Park, is because Elmhurst Park is the site of the brand new Queens Vietnam Veteran Memorial. It was just dedicated in December last year. So again, if you ever want to come and take a more extensive tour around Elmhurst, that's why I'm mentioning some of these other places that we weren't able to include on this route. And again, I encourage everybody to type in any questions you may have. We are back on 43rd Avenue, again, just off Judge Street. And this house, this unassuming house here on 43rd Avenue, is another place that is getting some attention from the Elmhurst History and Cemeteries Preservation Society. The woman who lived in this house, it's known as the Yanta House, J-A-N-T-A. And that was the last name of the woman who lived in this house for over 60 years. She just passed away in the past year. She was a Polish immigrant. During World War II, she was the secretary to the Prime Minister of Poland's government in exile. And in that job, she translated many documents into English, and those were documents that first exposed some of the horrors and information about the Holocaust to the English-speaking world, to America. After the war, she moved here with her husband, so she lived in this house, as I said, until just a few months ago when she passed away at the age of 107. She and her husband in this house turned this home really into a hub of cultural life for Polish expatriates and others. Many activists and intellectuals came here. They sort of had a salon. It is believed that possibly, I'm forgetting. I mean, possibly, well, a number of well-known people, as well as many prominent Polish writers visited them here. So it has a cultural significance, as well as the historic significance of what she did. Now, just next to it is a former American Legion Hall. Known as Elmhurst Memorial Hall. It kind of stands here in tandem with the Veterans Grove Park. And on the other side, these row houses are also ones that were constructed by the Cord-Meyer Company. I mentioned that Cord-Meyer, that real estate company still exists. They're headquartered, I believe, on Queens Boulevard in Forest Hills. And Forest Hills was another of the neighborhoods that Cord-Meyer developed in the early 20th century, in addition to Elmhurst. About it is because it is a great neighborhood to come to enjoy some very authentic ethnic cooking, particularly various Asian cuisines. Some of it very specific to certain regions. And now as we continue along Whitney Avenue and then turn back onto Broadway, you will see the variety of cuisines you can enjoy here. On this stretch of Whitney, there's an Indonesian restaurant next to a Chinese eatery, next to a Thai restaurant. Elmhurst is part of the Chinatown of Queens, which of course is centered in Flushing. But if that hasn't already become apparent, you will see when we reach Broadway. But before that, continuing just one more block here on Whitney Avenue, there's an Indian sweet shop, another Thai restaurant. And then when we turn onto Broadway, you will immediately see a number of Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese, there's a sushi place, there's a Malaysian restaurant. So this is why they say you can eat your way around the world in Elmhurst. Are there any questions? So we're back here on Broadway. Now, from this corner of Broadway and Whitney, you can see Elmhurst Hospital. Darren, maybe from here. It's several blocks down there, but you can identify it. It looks like a hospital building and has the blue letters at the top. Elmhurst Hospital is the second oldest public hospital in New York City, second only to Bellevue. It was originally known as City Hospital, located on Roosevelt Island, or what's today known as Roosevelt Island. It was first established there in the 1830s. So as City Hospital, it played a key role during the United States' last pandemic, which was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. City Hospital moved to larger and newer facilities here on Broadway in Elmhurst in the 1950s. So that's Elmhurst Hospital. We just are going one more block to another park, and then I'm going to tell you about a few other places in Elmhurst that we can't quite get to because it would make the tour a little too long. So I'm now at Broadway and 45th Avenue, and behind me is the Moore Homestead Park. It sounds like the subway is stopping. Oh wait, don't show that yet. Can you not show that yet? We are actually right on top of the Elmhurst Avenue station on the R line. The Moores are one of the founding families of Elmhurst, or Newtown, or Middleburg, actually. Reverend John Moore was one of the founders of that settlement in the 17th century. And his son built a house here on what today is this park. That house actually stood into the 1930s. So it was used for many generations of the Moore family. Is that going to interrupt? It shouldn't, or it should? Yeah. Okay. Many of the Moores were in the clergy. A number of them are associated with St. James. And actually, two of them served as president of Columbia University. But the most famous member of the family is Clement Clark Moore. So he would have been the great-great-great-grandson of Newtown or Middleburg founder John Moore. And you probably recognize that name as the author of The Night Before Christmas. Now, this park is, as you can see from the sign, undergoing a renovation. Had it not been for COVID, I'm going to guess this would have been completed by now, because I believe the park has now been closed for well over a year. So kind of looking forward to that. This is one of the main parks here in Elmhurst. And it has traditionally been known. I mean, the name was the Moore Homestead Park. I think they now really want to play up the connection with Clement Clark Moore. And although he did not live in that Moore house, it is believed he did spend time here. I mean, he lived actually more in Manhattan, what's today the Chelsea neighborhood. But he did come here and spend time here. And there's still often an annual reading of The Night Before Christmas here. So that's a pop culture connection here in Elmhurst that just about everyone knows was The Night Before Christmas. Now, when I do tours of Elmhurst in person, I do often continue from this point along Broadway. I'm just not going to be doing it today because it's a little too far and there would just be too much walking along streets between sites that I don't think is that conducive for a virtual tour. But I want to mention what there is to see. So again, I mentioned that just a few blocks down is Elmhurst Hospital. Right in front of Elmhurst Hospital is where Broadway crosses Woodside Avenue. So if you take Woodside Avenue there, you enter what's known as Little Thailand. It's the center of the Thai community in New York City. You've probably heard about the great Thai restaurants here. Many of them are located along that stretch of Woodside Avenue. There are also Thai grocery stores and other shops and organizations serving the community. But because this is Elmhurst, there are other groups and people represented there. At Woodside Avenue, I think it's at 76th Street, is a Sindhi temple, that's spelled S-I-N-D-H-I, which is an ethnic group of Pakistan. Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, was a Sindhi. Their temple is known as a Gur Mandir, combining Mandir, the word for Hindu temple, and Gurdwara, which is the word used for Sikh temples. And then if you turn at 76th Street and head just a few blocks as if you're walking in the direction of Queens Boulevard, that's when you can visit. We see this? I'm showing a picture here of a Thai Buddhist temple And again, anybody is welcome to visit this. You can actually see, we're having a little trouble because the sun has ducked behind some clouds. You can see the top of this temple from Queens Boulevard. This is one of the largest Thai temples in the eastern United States. Here's a front of it. It is known as Wat Thavorn Varam. And as I mentioned, you're welcome to go inside, but you don't even have to go inside because right outside there's all types of statues, including this very large reclining Buddha. I'm hoping you're all able to see these pictures. We're trying to photograph pictures on a tablet here, so there's a lot of glare going on. So again, the religious diversity that's represented in just walking a few blocks, because also on that walk on the way to the Thai Buddhist temple, there is the United Sherpa Society, which took over a Lutheran church, very colorful building now. There are two Seventh-day Adventist churches. I think they're like practically right around the corner from each other. One is English speaking and one is a Chinese congregation. There is also an Eastern Orthodox church in St. Mary's right in that area. And again, this is just off Woodside Avenue in the mid-70s here in Elmhurst. And one other place in Elmhurst that I did want to mention because it is a New York City landmark. It's located on Queens Boulevard. So again, if you've driven along Queens Boulevard, oops, perhaps you've seen this guy, a life-size elk. That building, as you can see, or hopefully see in this picture, it's now known as the New Life Fellowship Church, a Korean church. But this statue stands in front of an Elks Lodge built in 1923. That was the largest Elks Lodge in the eastern United States. It had 6,600 members at its peak. And this building had a 24-hour doorman. It had a bowling alley. It had a theater with a stained glass ceiling and a Wurlitzer organ, a restaurant. There were hotel rooms, guest rooms, a sauna. I think I mentioned the swimming pool, a gym, a barber shop on site. But of course, as demographics, the population of Queens changed starting after World War II. Membership dwindled, and the building was eventually sold to a church, which still maintains it and has owned it since about 2001. So that's Elmhurst, or at least part of Elmhurst. I want to thank everybody again for joining us, and I do want to mention that I had been scheduled to do a number of tours for the Queens Historical Society in different neighborhoods around Queens this past spring. So of course those got canceled, and we were hoping we'd be able to fit them in the fall, but things still not quite secure enough for in-person touring. So we're now, of course, looking at spring 2021. Unfortunately, that may end up being too hopeful, but just please keep your eyes and ears open once things do start to reopen more. As I said, I'll be doing some tours in several different neighborhoods. The Queens Historical Society has reopened Kingsland Homestead. It's the historic house that is its home base in Flushing. So please check that out. You can pay a visit. Obviously, there is limited hours and admission to maintain safety. Oh, and they're asking that you now reserve tickets ahead of time. And what else can I tell you? Well, I did mention this book I wrote. It's called Walking Queens. 30 tours for discovering the diverse communities, historic places, and natural treasures of New York City's largest borough. Great pandemic activity. If you haven't already, I mean, you probably have been doing, walking, because for several months when gyms were closed and nobody was going to work, that was pretty much how people would get any exercise or fresh air, just take a walk. But this book has guided tours, so it's all do it yourself. Just bring your feet. It gives you complete directions in, it's actually more than 30 neighborhoods that are covered on these tours. They range from like 1.5 miles to as long as 4 or 5 miles. I also include the directions if you're coming by public transportation, how to get to and from the tour. So please check that out. And you can also purchase it through the Queens Historical Society website. Are there any questions to wrap up with?
You can also mention the donations.
Oh, yes. Also, in our the chat area, we are posting a link where you can make some donations to the Queens Historical Society. We do very much appreciate that.
Someone has posted, thank you, Adrienne. I'm looking forward to more of your reports. Very interesting.
Okay, well, this was a new experience for me. I had not done any virtual tours. I've been basically sitting out the tour business. I actually did a program for the Queens Library over the summer, but that was more of a slideshow online. So thank you for bearing with me and with us as we work through any noise or tech issues. But I do hope you enjoyed yourself. And again, please just continue to follow Queens Historical Society for various events, including more tours that I'll be doing. And come on out and check out Elmhurst.
Someone say, super cool. Thank you so much. So knowledgeable and interesting. So another person says, I had registered for all 4 of those spring tours, so I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Glad to hear that. Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Email any questions to info@queenshistoricalsociety.com.
Oh, okay. I'm back because I have been told that we should mention, if you have any questions, please email the Historical Society. The email address is info@queenshistoricalsociety.org. Okay, thanks so much. Bye.